don't think it's controversial to say that survival horror hasn't been doing too well over the last decade. Resident Evil has been struggling to balance action and horror ever since Resident Evil 4. Silent Hill hasn't had a new game in a decade. And while looking at the reviews, it's understandable why. Dead Space also hadn't had a new game for a decade, until the remake finally came down from the heavens to bless the Dead Space fans. And what else is there? Sure, the indie scene has produced quite a few gems. Amnesia the Bunker was fantastic. Hey, that's a review I did. However, those games can't really match the budget of AAA. And AAA developers either don't have any faith in the marketability of survival horror games, or they just don't care enough to take any risks when they can instead just throw a couple jump scares at you and call that a horror game. Or just leave horror games altogether and just shit out another Assassin's Creed instead. So, what else really is there besides the big franchises? Well, besides Resident Evil, because the other big franchises have basically been dead for the past decade. Well, what if I tell you that there's one game I neglected to mention? A complicated little game with quite a few issues, but also a lot to offer. A game made by the original director of Resident Evil. That game also happens to be called The Evil Within, because I guess Shinji Mikami doesn't have much fucking originality when it comes to naming his games. Shinji Mikami is an interesting figure in the game industry, being the director for both Resident Evil 1 and 4, along with Dino Crisis, and being the producer for Resident Evil 2, 3, Devil May Cry 1, a shit ton of lesser-known Resident Evil games, and, for some reason, Ace Attorney? Needless to say, without him, the horror genre would be unrecognizable. However, Shinji split from Capcom after the release of Resident Evil 4, and after a short stay at Platinum Games, he founded his own studio, that being Tango Gameworks. And the first game from Tango was The Evil Within, which began development in 2010 under the name Project Zwei, and was released in 2014. The Evil Within was partially a response to the increasing focus on action within the horror genre. After all, this was back in the early 2010s. The last two Resident Evil games tried and failed miserably to recapture the magic of 4, and Silent Hill's latest game was a dungeon crawler. And so, Shinji instead wanted to put the focus back on the horror. So, did he succeed? We play as Detective Sebastian Castellanos, a shambling mass of cliches, stereotypes, and booze. We have just received a call about multiple homicides at Beacon Mental Hospital. With us are our partner Joseph Oda and the rookie Juli Kidman. We arrive at the hospital, leaving Kidman outside as backup. Once we're inside, we find that everyone is fucking dead. Well, everyone except for one. Unfortunately, he's babbling incoherent nonsense about some ruvik, whatever the fuck that is. So, we leave Joseph to tend to the doctor as Sebastian decides to go take a look at the security cameras.
What the hell?
And next thing we know, we wake up dangling from the ceiling with a bunch of dead guys, and soon we learn who's responsible for all those dead guys. Now that's basically all you need to know. For now. We'll be getting back to the plot later. Oh, don't you worry, we'll be getting back to the plot. However, first we should probably discuss, the gameplay. But before I can actually get into the actual gameplay, there's just a couple things I have to address first. Now, I played on the PC port, which sucks balls. When I started up the game, it ran like piss, like 5 fucking frames a second. Okay, that might be slightly exaggerated, but it was not playable. So I eventually figured out how to run it at an acceptable frame rate, but let's just say it's not exactly the greatest fucking start, and I shouldn't have to fucking deal with that. Then there's the second issue. Crashes. Sometimes, randomly, the game decides to shit the bed and crash. Why? I don't know. It was mostly during the cutscenes, and sometimes I'd play through the cutscene and it would be fine, and sometimes it just crashed in the middle of the cutscene for some reason, and I have no clue why. It made recording pretty damn painful. And sometimes the game would just crash in the middle of gameplay, like doing nothing, weird, and just suddenly, oh, sorry buddy, game crashed. Then when I replay that section, it'd be totally fine. It makes no sense. Why? I don't know. However, it wasn't too common, and I generally didn't lose a lot of progress because of how often the game autosaves, but still pretty fucking annoying. However, interestingly enough, despite the fact that one of the main complaints people have about the game is FPS drops, I didn't really experience any frame rate issues. Maybe it's been patched on the PC port, maybe it's only an issue on the console versions, I don't know. Along with that, at times, enemies will also become mildly retarded as their pathing fucks off into space, at which point they'll walk into some random-ass object. Is it useful? Yes. Does it break the tension? Also yes. It's not especially common though. There's also a lot of visual issues. Textures will load in late during cutscenes. Now, in my experience, this wasn't as bad as it was made out to be, but that's just my experience. It might be a lot more annoying for some people, and it was still pretty noticeable for me. The lighting is also kind of bad at times. Most of the time it looks pretty damn good, but sometimes not so much. The animations are kind of janky at times. I mean, just look at this. Sebastian literally teleports onto the trap. What the fuck? And lastly, every time I started a new chapter, the foliage would have a fucking seizure. Every fucking time. And this doesn't go away either. This stays for the entire fucking chapter. The only way I found to fix this was to close and reopen the game, at which point it would just fix itself. For some reason, it was extremely annoying to have to constantly close the game every new fucking chapter. But then sometimes after I died, it would also fix itself. So, now luckily there are quite a few chapters in which there isn't much foliage, but still, it would sometimes ruin awesome set pieces just because, like, I want to look at this cool ass, train stretched across this abyss, but I can't because the fucking tree is stretching all over the place. So, you might think that I hate the game, but honestly, I really don't. All these issues are definitely very annoying at times. But I felt that while these problems were noticeable, they were never really bad enough to completely ruin the experience, and even the fucked up foliage I could ignore most of the time unless it was in a chapter with a lot of foliage. Most of the issues were minor enough that I could just ignore them. Of course, that's just my humble opinion. So, where were we again? Oh yeah, being tied up in a murder basement. So we managed to untie ourselves and sneak the fuck away from the creepy chainsaw-wielding maniac. Unfortunately for us, we're not out in the woods yet. Shit. So we have to sneak around while he's hunting us. It's pretty basic: crouch, stay out of sight. You can also hide in lockers and under beds. Now, as I explained in my Amnesia Debunker review, yes, that's a second shameless self-promo. I'm not the biggest fan of this type of gameplay. Call me impatient, but I just don't like waiting in the locker for the monster to fuck off. Luckily, or unluckily for those who like this kind of gameplay, the game only focuses on stealth during the opening section. Sure, sneak killing is a thing, so you could stealth your way through the entire game if you really want to, but the game very much encourages you to take the gunny shoot route. So after escaping the sadist, we make it back outside and find... Now, the game really loves these epic Hollywood scenes. Are they a bit over the top? Oh, absolutely. But are they pretty awesome? Also, yes. It's a good thing that they are somewhat rare, as, well, having too many of these scenes can very easily turn your horror game into an action game. Resident Evil 6. The gang manages to make it out of the city, but unfortunately for them, there's someone else with them. And also Connolly isn't feeling too well. And so, with their pilot currently having a bit of a seizure, the ambulance drives off a cliff. Sebastian eventually wakes up in the smoldering wreck of the ambulance, and this is the first time the foliage decided to freak out. But after I fix that, we find Connolly, who... We find Connolly, who's not doing too hot, so we shoot him. This is where you'll get your first taste of the combat, and overall, it's pretty good. Your arsenal is whittled down to the basics. You've got your pistol for the basic enemies, and for when you're low on ammo for the other guns. You've got the shotgun for dealing with the big boys, or if you're cornered by a bunch of enemies. The sniper for long range, and for picking the enemies off before they get close to you. Grenades, because duh, I don't need to explain grenades. And lastly, and most interestingly, there's the Agony Crossbow. This is one of the game's most unique aspects. The Agony Crossbow is, well, a crossbow, I don't know what else you expected. Now, it takes a while to charge up, has somewhat limited range, but deals fucking amazing damage. But that's only with the standard bolt. You see, the crossbow has 5 different types of bolts. There's the shock bolt, for stunning enemies. Oh wow, how surprising. It's useful for groups and for bosses. There's the freeze bolt, which is basically the shock bolt, but single target and way better. And the explosive bolt. I don't think I need to explain that one. And the flash bolt, which also briefly stuns enemies, but this one, unlike the shock bolt, allows you to sneak kill enemies, which I never did. Now, this might seem a little bit OP, but the game rarely just gives you any of these bolts. Instead, you have to craft them. Now, I know that half of you just went down on your knees and screamed to the skies above because, god damn it, the game has a crafting system. But listen, it's really not as bad as it sounds, okay? The crafting system is really simple. You open up the inventory, and you just craft whatever bolt you have enough parts for. All bolts use the exact same ingredient, that being parts. There's nothing fancy going on. The more useful bolts obviously cost more parts, while the standard harpoon bolt just costs 2. These parts can be gathered through disarming traps laid around the environment. These range from simple tripwire traps, which explode, to bear traps, to these annoying ass explosive traps which you gotta time correctly or it'll explode in your fucking face. You can also use them to your advantage. You can lure the enemies into tripwire traps to save a bit of ammo. Oh, and there's also your melee attack. It's pretty fucking useless. However, there are 2 actually useful melee weapons. You can occasionally find axes and torches lying around, or you can take them from some enemies. Both are one-time use, but they both insta-kill most regular enemies, and the torch can even catch numerous enemies on fire at the same time. But speaking of the enemies, there isn't too much variety in terms of basic enemies. You'll almost exclusively fight these guys, the Haunted. But what they lack in variety, they make up for in their intelligence. Sometimes they'll be carrying axes or torches, sometimes they wear porcelain masks, which make getting those headshots way more difficult. Later they'll even start wearing steel masks, which you can't shoot through at all. Later in the game, they'll also start carrying pistols, shotguns, even fucking machine guns. There's also these guys with like 2 heads who can spit acid at you, which I never got hit by. But occasionally they'll also have like this fucking chestburster attack where a giant ass fucking tentacle will sprout from their fucking chest, which is an insta-kill if it hits you. And there's also these little guys that you can just stomp on, which is fucking hilarious. But that's about it. Mind you, these 2 are way rarer than the regular old Haunted. Now, there is one easy way to deal with them. You see, you can find these matchboxes everywhere. If you manage to knock one of the bastards down, Or if you notice that one of the corpses lying around might not be so dead after all, you can throw a match on them to burn the fuckers. Hell, you can also just burn actual corpses to catch any enemies walking over them on fire. Hell, you can even catch multiple enemies on fire if they're standing close enough. Both the matches and the crossbow really help to make the combat feel unique from other games, and overall the combat is a pretty great mix of tactics and plain old shooty gun. However, there are issues. First of which is Sebastian's fucking stamina. Sebastian can run for about 5 seconds before he has to stop to catch his breath, at which point you'll be screaming, "Sebastian, what the fuck are you doing? Move your fucking ass!" While the multi-armed abomination trying to murder you rapidly crawls towards you to fuck you. It is fucking asinine. I have no idea why they decided to make the stamina this piss, but whatever. Luckily for you, there is a way to fix this. Well, fix is a strong word, but we can make it slightly less irritating. You see, throughout the game, you'll be collecting green gel, which you can use to, well, upgrade yourself by injecting it directly into your fucking brain. This is how you level up various things, such as reload speed, clip capacity, the damage of your weapons. Don't ask me why injecting gel into your brain makes your guns better. I'm not quite sure. You can even upgrade your crossbow bolts, make the explosion of the explosive bolt bigger, make the fucking shock bolts last longer, your standard stuff. You can also upgrade your melee damage. I have no idea why that's an option, but whatever. It's pretty simple stuff, but if it works, it works. There's no need to overcomplicate things. Now, the actual environments that you'll be exploring are quite interesting. In the first half of the game, the levels are more open. This is where stealth is most viable. There's plenty of paths around the levels to deal with the haunted individually, and you will want to deal with them individually, as the ammo is much more limited in the first half of the game, and well, your best weapons are gonna be the pistol and shotgun, while the latter half of the game becomes more linear. Claustrophobic corridors and much closer encounters with the haunted are much more common, not to mention their much stronger weaponry. Puzzles also exist. They're piss easy. Press the button with the right symbol, put this item in that spot, you get it. You'd have to be brain dead or straight up dead to struggle with these. What's the point of having puzzles if they're this easy? At least the lack of difficulty also means that they won't be wasting much of your time. Mixed in are quite a few Hollywood-esque action scenes. Some of them are pretty awesome, a lot of them are kinda clunky, like this sequence after the Heresy boss. The boss itself is alright, it's nothing too crazy, but it's a neat little set-piece fight. But the short section where you have to take control of the bus is janky as hell. You can literally see the enemies spawn in. Like, that's the type of lack of polish that's kind of a problem. And this is just one example, there's more, but I don't want this video to be like an hour long. But now that we've mentioned one of the bosses, why don't we actually talk about those? The bosses are another mixed bag. Some are pretty cool, some are kinda boring, and some are kinda annoying, and some are utter bullshit. The one you probably know, even if you haven't played the game, is the Keeper, who looks very familiar. Yeah, he's kind of a Pyramid Head ripoff. Originally they weren't even gonna include him because of that, but personally I'm glad they didn't cut him because he's one of the coolest bosses in the game. You encounter the Keeper 3 times. The first one's the most interesting. At first it seems pretty normal. Yeah, shooty until Safeface vomits up his contents. But then the bastard fucking revives himself. And yes, this will keep happening forever. Or at least close enough to forever that it doesn't really matter. The fight isn't really about fighting him, it's just about creating small windows for you to get done what needs to be done before Lockerhead cracks your head open. The second encounter is similar but much less elaborate. You find the Keeper trying to murder Joseph. This time though, you just gotta escape through the dumbwaiter. Most of the bosses are actually reoccurring, and not just in boss fights, they'll also appear in chases and just small cutscenes and such, like Laura. Laura is the scariest fucking thing in the entire fucking game. Just like the Keeper, you can't kill her, but instead of just reviving, she just straight up doesn't care if you shoot her. Fire is the only thing that actually hurts her. In the first fight, you just gotta burn her a couple times, while in the second encounter, you gotta break all these valves around the arena to shut off this fire gate thing. You gotta do this a couple times, actually. Overall, both of these bosses are pretty good, and they are the bosses you probably already know because they were the most marketed. However, some are just fucking shite. Like Amalgam Alpha. The build up to the boss fight is pretty great. You get teleported into this underground car park, and yes, as you explore the place, the boss is very much aware that you're there. It will ram the walls, even tries to grab you through the vents. Honestly, I wish this lasted longer because it's fucking terrifying to me. I've always hated the idea of being trapped in like a building with a giant fucking monster. The fight though, the first half is fine. Shoot him in the big dick eye and run the fuck away, grab some ammo, shooty, grenade. The main problem is that the game isn't really equipped to handle big monsters. That, mixed with some big ass hitboxes and the absolute piss shit stamina. But overall, it's pretty alright. But the second phase is total bullshit. Fuck this guy, fuck his insta-kill bullshit, and fuck this bullshit hitbox. Luckily, he doesn't have much health left at this point, so the torture doesn't last too long, but god fucking damn it, I had to fucking attempt this way too many times, and it felt like slamming my head into a brick wall. In fact, I think I would have enjoyed that more. And really, the final boss is the perfect example of how mixed the bosses are. On one hand, it's an epic, awesome, scripted sequence where you fuck up a giant fucking abomination with a motherfucking bazooka. On the other hand, it's a completely scripted sequence without any of the combat mechanics you've learned throughout the entire rest of the game. I get that you can't really have the player fight a giant-ass monster like this normally, but it's still annoying that the combat mechanics get completely thrown out of the window. Like, why did I learn them then, if you're not even gonna use them in the final boss fight? So, at this point you might be wondering why I like this game so much. I mean, yeah, the gameplay's pretty good, but the game's got quite a few issues. So what's so special about this game? Well, it's the art direction. I think that The Evil Within is one of the most visually memorable AAA games I've ever played. Monster designs are fucking amazing. They're not only memorable as hell, but they're also pretty terrifying. Take Laura, for example. It's a pretty simple design, long black hair, long nails, some extra arms, and burns. And ta-da! Absolute nightmare fuel. Same with the Keeper. He's basically just a butcher with a safehead, but that's what makes it great. It's simple, memorable, and intimidating. As for the environments you explore, they're just as great. They're almost normal, but they're always twisted in some way. They're claustrophobic, dark, and once again, extremely memorable. Every area is distinct. Every area feels unique. And there's always this feeling that there's just something not quite right. From the medieval village you explore at the start of the game, to the catacombs below the church of the village, the hotel filled with the Keeper's traps, and lastly, Beacon Mental Hospital itself. All of these areas are fantastic. But while all of this sounds good, there's one little problem. The game is not very scary, which is a problem, as last I checked, this was a survival horror game. Now, there are tense moments and sections, but scary? Not really. It's partially because the epic action moments, which, while cool as hell, also ruin the horror. I can't be scared of the haunted if the next moment I'm shooting dozens of them with a fucking machine gun. The other issue is, it's just the game is too focused on combat in general. You're pretty much forced to kill most monsters you encounter. In fact, there's quite a few sections where you just have to kill all of them to progress. And I can't be scared if I'm constantly murdering dozens of monsters. Does that mean that there's no horror at all? No, there are plenty of tense moments to build up to the Amalgam Alpha boss fight. Laura, the Keeper, Ruvik. There's tension, but it's not consistent enough to make me scared. Here's the thing, you don't want to keep playing a good horror game. There's always that slight bit of hesitation, that slight feeling of, oh god, I don't want to go back into that hellhole. You know that you're gonna be fucking terrified, but you want to be terrified. That's why you end up playing the game anyways. But I never felt that hesitation when playing The Evil Within. I kept playing because of the combat, the environments, the monsters, even the story, but not the horror. It's just not that scary. But there's one more part of the game I haven't talked about yet. Now we finally get to the plot. The part that everybody criticized, the part that all the critics hated. It's been called nonsensical, convoluted, filled with forgettable and uninteresting characters, and dumbass moments and decisions. And while I agree with a lot of that, I just don't think that the plot is actually that convoluted. The game very explicitly tells you what's going on.
We're working on a method. How can I explain this? It's like linking brains together. Showing everything on an electrochemical level. Emotion, memory, perception, everything. Directly. It's unprecedented. The implications on psychology, on pharmaceuticals, on consciousness itself.
Are you serious? It's a fucking nightmare.
Well, I didn't say it was perfect. Especially not with such a unstable host.
Great. So your research partner is a psychopath. And we're all inside his head.
Not exactly, no. All of us are contributing on some level. But he's the only one with conscious influence.
This world is not real. You and everyone else are in a simulation. Basically, everyone's hooked up to this machine called STEM, which allows their brains and thoughts to become linked. Everyone contributes to creating this simulated world to some extent, but the only person with conscious control is Ruvik, the game's main villain. But Ruvik is also just a brain in a jar. Literally, he is the core of the machine. His brain has been removed and is being kept alive to keep the machine working. However, Ruvik is still fully conscious and he's not happy about being stuck in a jar. And his escape is through Leslie, the most stereotypical mental patient you have ever seen in your entire life. And it's implied, and by implied I mean that the game practically slaps you in the face with it, that Ruvik is successful in taking over Leslie's body and escaping back into reality. And of course, while Ruvik was still a brain with a body, he was actually the inventor of STEM. And helping him was his partner and mentor, Dr. Marcelo Jimenez, who was also the director at Beacon Mental Hospital, which is of course where they tested STEM. Of course, experiments like this require funding, and while the base game never explicitly names the organization who funded the experiments, in the DLC, we learn that it's an organization called Mobius. Think the Illuminati, but cooler. And while Mobius obviously wants to use STEM for their own gain, Ruvik instead simply wants to use STEM to reunite with his dead sister, who burned to death in a barn fire, which is also where Ruvik got his horrific burns from, which caused Ruvik to go just a little bit crazy, which made him a bit too unreliable for Mobius. So they jarred him. That's basically most of the plot, and while yes, some of it is told to you through notes, and most of it isn't told chronologically, if you use the arcane art of thinking, you'll probably figure it out. Fucking Markiplier figured most of it out. Simply put, just pay attention and don't expect the game to just spoon-feed the plot to you, and you'll probably figure most of it out. Not to mention, the DLC clarifies most of the plot. Does that mean the plot is good? No. It's not bad. It's not really good either. It's got a lot of issues. It's filled with bland characters, plot holes, and just dumbass moments. One of my personal favorite annoyances is, how old is Ruvik supposed to be? Yes, this might seem like a minor thing, but listen to me for a moment. At numerous points throughout the game, we get to explore Ruvik's memories, and in all of these, it feels like they're set in, and I'm being generous here, at most the 1950s. From the fact he was part of a noble family, to the way everyone dresses. But then, what about Jimenez? If I'm generous, then he's at most in his early 60s, and there's no way that he's younger than 30 in Ruvik's memories, which means that Ruvik, and again, I'm being generous here, can't be more than like 40. And the game seems to take place in the 2010s. Sure, you could argue that it takes place in the 90s to try and make sense of this, but there's no indication that it takes place in the 90s, and in fact, everything just indicates that it's supposed to take place in the 2010s. So, at the latest, Ruvik's memories take place somewhere in the 70s, and last I checked, people didn't dress like they were from the 1920s in the 70s. That's just one of the issues which annoys me personally, but there's more problems. Sebastian is, as I said earlier, the most stereotypical detective ever. He's an alcoholic, he lost his family, he's gruff, skeptical, but secretly he does care. You know exactly what kind of character Sebastian is. Leslie is the worst though, just because he's literally just a stereotype with nothing more to him. Jimenez and Joseph are better. Throughout the game, Joseph has to deal with Ruvik trying to influence him, trying to turn him into one of the haunted, and the way he describes it is pretty interesting.
You ever had the urge to just jump? When you're on a high place? Or the subway rolls by? Imagine if you had that urge for a minute straight. Then 2 minutes.
You fought it off 3 times now, Joseph. You're learning to stop it.
You're not listening. I'm not worried about stopping it, Seb. I'm worried about not wanting to stop it.
Sure, there's not exactly a lot to it, but it's interesting. Jimenez is also pretty decently written. He, to some extent, regrets the part he played in both Ruvik's research and his eventual dissection. On the other hand, Jimenez also has a lot of ambition and scientific curiosity, and of course, by the time he realized what he'd gotten himself into and who he's actually working for, well, it was already too late. As for Ruvik, he makes for a pretty good villain. He's pretty threatening, very involved in the story, and overall, the way you slowly discover his backstory and motivation is pretty engaging. Now, he is pretty edgy, which does make him a little bit difficult to take seriously at times, and while I think the performance is perhaps a little bit much at times, overall, he makes for a pretty good villain. There's just one major issue. If Ruvik has almost total control over the world within STEM, then why doesn't he just kill Sebastian? There's numerous moments where he easily could, but he just doesn't. And I get that Ruvik likes playing with his victims, but Sebastian is a pretty big problem for him, so why doesn't he kill Seb? Is he stupid? So yeah, this story isn't as bad as the reviews made it out to be, but it still has a lot of issues. Now originally I was also gonna talk about the DLC in this video, but I can't. This video is already long enough, and the DLC, well, it would add like at least another 10 minutes onto it. Also, it means that I can milk the ever-loving fuck out of it and make another video. But that's besides the point. So for now, I'll just say, yeah, the DLC is pretty good. So, that brings us to the last question. Is the evil within good? Well, in my humble opinion, yes, but I can't blame anybody who doesn't like the game due to the many issues the game has. From the seizure-inducing foliage, to the random crashes, to the issues with the gameplay, graphics, and story. I really can't blame anybody for not wanting to deal with all of that, but I think that if you're willing to push past that shit, it is a pretty good game. The combat, the level design, the atmosphere, the art direction, it lacks horror, so to answer the question from the beginning of the video, no, it does not succeed at being a good horror game, but I think that underneath all of that is a good game. Personally, I like The Evil Within, despite its many issues. So, with all of that said, if you liked the video, Why don't you like the video? If you like my content, subscribe. Maybe leave a comment. I have other things to do. Well, I'm gonna try to not have another month-long gap between videos. Goodbye.
Fly me to the moon so I can kick its fucking ass.